Hi everyone, welcome back to Bodhi Tree Buddhism. Today is class 21 in our series on the way to Buddhahood, that modern classic of Chinese Buddhism from the one and only Venerable Master in Shuan. As you can see, the setup's a little bit different today. I'm just out of town, but still doing the classes on the road. The lighting's horrible and everything else is horrible, but the content is the same, so don't worry. We hopefully can finish off the section on the Dharma common to the 5 vehicles today, but we'll see how it goes. So with no further ado, let's just jump on in, shall we? So we're up to the end of this section on the 3 meritorious actions. So we've been talking about this for a couple of weeks now. Remember, we've got generosity or giving, we've got ethics, precepts, or morality, whatever term you want to use, and we've got the fundamentals of meditation practice as well. So these are our 3 so-called meritorious actions. And we've gone through them each in turn. There's some more detail coming up, particularly on meditation later in the text. But to round out the section here, The Way to Buddhahood, the book, has got a couple of little things here. So one of them is the ranking of the 3 meritorious actions. This is kind of interesting. We'll be covering this first. And then we'll also be talking about the recollections, which we'll get to in a minute. So let's first of all jump into the ranking of the 3 meritorious actions in order of importance. So as usual, first the Chinese and then the English. 布施多杂然 禅定想笃善 依人向佛道 戒行为宗要. There's a nice classic bit of rhyme in this verse today as well. Giving in charity is often tainted. Dhyana meditation may lead only to self-benefit. For the path to Buddhahood, based on a human life, practice of morality is the most important element. No rhyme here in the English, thanks to my translation. So it gives, it talks about all 3 of them. So the first comment is talking about giving and generosity. Dana, giving in charity, is often tainted. So what's meant by that? Well, I think one of the ideas here is that, the ideal of being able to give entirely selflessly for the benefits of others is a good ideal, but to actually do it is actually not so simple. So, we often have all sorts of other motivations going on. And we talked about these actually earlier in the text about sort of ways of not doing charity or ways of not doing giving. So this includes, where we kind of become a little bit transactional. We give expecting something in return, or we give for some prestige reasons. We want other people to see us do it and so forth. Or you get into some charity because there's some lottery, it's a chance to win a prize, all sorts of other reasons. So this is sort of what I think Master Inshuan here means when he talks about often tainted. So towards Zaran, taint, I'm not sure if it's the right word, but Zaran means like there's kind of a combination of good and negative motivations in that. So, when you are giving to that charity, hoping that you can win some lottery ticket, there is that good side of it. Like, oh, it's a children's hospital, that's great, but but I get, I'm in the draw for prizes, so that's good too. We shouldn't need that kind of second part. As for meditation side, that's line 2, dhyana meditation may lead only to self-benefit. Note, it says may only, and in Chinese it's a xiang, it's sort of like a tendency towards it. It's not an absolute. It's not saying that meditation is solely for self-benefit, but it can sometimes be seen in that way. So if we think, for example, in many contemporary Buddhist traditions, we've got a real big emphasis on meditation. That really is this central thing. It's all about meditation. There's a number of groups like this. I don't need to name names. You know what I'm talking about. But there's also some other groups that are really into social work and social activism. And sometimes, and for some people, and I definitely don't want to say they're necessarily in sort of opposition to each other, but for some people, they might feel like, hey, why are you doing this, long meditation retreat or doing these things when there's people out there in society that need our help, and we should be getting off our butts, getting butt off the cushion, and you should be out there running a soup kitchen, helping the homeless, you know, exerting some sort of political pressure for unjust laws. Sure, all these things are, you know, really good and really worthwhile. So I think the idea here being that, you know, sometimes people can get a little bit too you know, kind of almost contradictory, self-involved in meditation, and kind of forget about other people. And so that can also be a bit of a problem too. Note for line 3, for the path to Buddhahood, right? So, I mean, at this level of the text, we're still only talking about the foundation for all 5 vehicles. So you need generosity and you need meditation. But if we're talking about the path to Buddhahood, you can't just like exclusively practice meditation, because part of the path to Buddhahood is also, you know, actions for the benefit of others. Now, just a note here, this doesn't mean that actual meditation is only for one's own benefit. Like I said, it doesn't always mean that, because let's say if we can meditate and we can get rid of our own problems and deal with our own issues, and we can, you know, get ourselves in better states of mind, that also helps the people around us, right? So these 2 first points are kind of tendencies and possibilities. They're not saying that all charity is tainted and that all meditation is purely for the benefit of the meditator. But if we look at lines 3 and 4, right, for the path to Buddhahood based on a human life, and that's really the main emphasis of this whole text, right? And it's really like, that's the basis of humanistic Buddhism, Renjin Forjiao, or the earlier form by Master Taishu, Rensheng Forjiao, Buddhism for human life. It really is, we're humans, this is how we are now, and our ultimate goal is Buddhahood. And if that's the case, what's the most important? Line 4, practice of morality is the most important element. Now, I would like to say that, no, I don't, I should have done my homework. I should have pulled out the original text and just seen what sources that Master Inshun has for the whole of this verse 56 here. But I would like to say, I think we do need to keep in mind for this particular verse, maybe more than some of the others, the specific context in which this book was originally written. So back in, I guess it's the 50s, late 40s, 50s, in China, and what was going on in China at that time is important. And so I think, particularly when we look at the one on Gyan meditation may lead to only self-benefit, you know, there was so much work that needed to be done in the entirety of Chinese society, not just Chinese Buddhist society, but like the whole nation, that, you know, many people would feel like you're going on a long retreat up into the mountains, but like society is in chaos. Like that can be quite perceived as a selfish action. And also for the last comment about the practice of morality, I don't know if I mentioned this before, there's this really cool book called, what's the name of the book, Matt? My Search for the Dharma, I think that's the one. My Search for the Dharma, something like that. It's by a master called Master Zhenhua, and he's basically like a contemporary of Master Inchun, probably a little bit younger, and so he was a young monk, I guess, back in like maybe at least the 30s and 40s, and okay, long story short. So, you know, that period of time where these ideas of like Buddhism for human life and humanistic Buddhism were formed in China, mainly like 30s, 40s, 50s. And then after that, you know, they were mainly brought to Taiwan, where they were really developed a lot more. This young monk had gone through that process, and it's basically autobiographical, but when you see him describing the situation of Buddhism, like around the kind of Nanjing area, which was a pretty important place for Buddhism in like most of the 20th century for China, you kind of like a bit face palmy. Like, oh man, like, you know, the monastic ethics was a problem, and Taishu was always talking about this. He wanted some serious monastic ethical review and revolution, and not really sort of like, oh, we need to go back to like the monastic discipline of ancient India. No, it wasn't that naive. But like, hey, there are some basic things that we really need to like clean up in here. And so I think that's also reflected in this verse as well. Now, I don't mean to then say, oh, therefore you can just kind of ignore this verse because we're in a different place and time. I think it's definitely still worth thinking about. But in that kind of thinking about process, we can just kind of think, so we've got these three meritorious actions. We've got generosity, we've got the practice of ethics, we've got the practice of meditation. They're all mutually influential, as are all our practices. Look at your own situation, as always. If you feel that you are lacking in resources, in general, in a broad sense, generosity is where we get our resources from. If you feel that the situation you're in is a little bit kind of chaotic, and there's not necessarily crime, but people are just kind of generally a bit unethical, then work on that. And you need both of those too. I mean, you really need you need to have resources, and you need to have good ethics before you can even talk about the meditative side of things. So have a little think about that. Okay, so let's go back now. We've still got like another verse or two that I want to hit today. Where are we? So the next bit here, recollection as a counteragent. Now there's a couple of technical terms here. Maybe I should just talk about these terms. So the first term is recollection. Now this in Chinese is nian or sui nian. Now this is exactly the same. So the character nian largely translates the Pali term sati or the Sanskrit word smriti. That is the term that's usually translated into English as mindfulness. Now you've got the same term. You've got sati and you've got anusati. Anu means like following. Now the English word mindfulness has become just so like ubiquitous. I mean, not just in Buddhist stuff. I remember once I was in the airport, I don't know, it's like Melbourne or something, waiting for a plane, and I was like, oh, let's just like have a little browse of the little tiny little bookstore. And I honestly feel that like a quarter of the books were mindfulness something or something. I was like blown away. Like, this is not like a spiritual bookstore. This is just like a bookstore in an airplane. And I was like, wow, this idea of mindfulness. And, I didn't go through them all to give them a full orthodox Buddhist assessment as to their validity or whatever, but just that popularity. Now, so you've got this whole idea of like mindfulness as this almost like generic term for like Buddhist meditation, but in its classical context, you do have forms like mindfulness of the body, where basically you're putting your mental focus on the body, mindfulness of the breath, which is basically like meditating on the breath and having the breath as your focus. But you've got this whole other category that's actually earlier than these, earlier in the sense of earlier in your path of progress. When we're talking about meditation here and these three meritorious actions, and I said it's meditation, but it's kind of like the foundations of meditation, then we use the same term anusati or anusmriti, but it's not really mindfulness. Recollection is a far better term, because as we're going to see in a minute, recollection of things, the things you think about and contemplate, they're like contemplations in a sense. They're not like, this comes down to what we mean in English by the word meditation. It's such a vague word and tries to include so much stuff. Anyway, recollections. And we've got this other term in the heading here, recollection as a counteragent. So in Chinese it's 对知, in Sanskrit it's pratyuksha. It means when you've got a specific problem, like mental, emotional, affective problem, and there's a specific meditation technique to deal with that. So not all meditations are like that. Anger, you use love and kindness, right? Just the basic like counter thing. And so here it's talking about using these forms of recollection as specific counteragents to specific issues. So let's go through this section here. 心性切为止，佛说应修念，细念佛法僧，戒施天功德，如入广明具，因暗依实施。For those whose minds are timid by nature, the Buddha taught they should cultivate 6 recollections, affixing mindfulness, you could say affixing recollection, on the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and the merit of morality, charity, and the divine. Just as entering into a bright radiance, the darkness of fear will immediately vanish. Okay, so the last couple of lines there are just kind of like a little metaphor that, if one is a bit timid or fearful in one's practice, these forms of practice will help us overcome that. Now, there's a bit of a background story. I think one of the most important, well-known background stories to this is the Buddha's cousin. Yeah, I think it's the Buddha's cousin, whose name is Mahanama. He was one of the few of the Shakyan princes, right? So the Buddha's like one of the Shakyan princes, and many of them renounced and became monks and nuns, and like huge numbers of the Shakyan clan like ended up becoming renunciants. But Mahanama didn't, and basically, so I'm going off topic and giving you like the whole family history of the Shakyan clan. So, the Buddha should have been the princes and the classical accounts and whatever. And then when he decides not to do that, then it's kind of passed down to his brother, Nanda. Of course, Nanda also became a monk, and then he passes down to like the next cousin, the next cousin, the next cousin. So Mahanama was one of the few that didn't, and he was the next in line. So he kind of became like the ruler, the head person for the Shakyan clan. He was incredibly devout still to the Buddha. And there's a certain where he's saying like, oh, sometimes I get like ridiculously busy. I have to like, deal with all this crazy stuff. He's like, imagine you're like the mayor or something. You're like, more than the village chief. And he's like, I have to watch out that I don't get run over by elephants in the streets. He literally says this. It's like, what? So like, elephants is like heavy traffic in ancient India. And he says, I'm worried that I'm going to, have an accident and I'm going to die, and my mind is going to be like totally distracted by something else, and I'm going to have a bad rebirth because, Lord Buddha, you've said that like, it's really important, our state of mind to death. So the Buddha says like, well, yo, cuz, okay, that's my very country New Zealand version. Yo, cuz, yo, bro, it's cool. You'll be okay because usually you're mindful of the Buddha. And so because you have that habit in general, even in other circumstances, if something bad happens, your mind will go in the right direction towards the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. So he says it's a bit like a tree that's growing at a certain place, and the wind blows it in a certain direction, so the tree's like leaning a certain way. If the tree falls over, it's going to fall that way because it's been leaning that way all its life. So likewise, you, Mahanama, because over the course of your life, your mind has been going in this direction, this tendency toward the Buddha. Therefore, don't worry at your time of death. You're going in the right direction. So that's, I think, one of the background stories here. And it wasn't just mindfulness of the Buddha. You got mindfulness of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. Those are the first three, which are, of course, the three jewels. So I think this is something that many Western forms of Buddhism, the kind of the stuff just kind of gets skipped. People just want to like immediately jump into meditation, insight. This practice of being mindful of or recollecting the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha is really foundational. I mean, usually if I'm teaching Buddhism more than like a single lecture, like a course or a larger program, be it sort of even like a little retreat or undergrad degree, graduate degree. I mean, I've taught these for many years. One of the things I always want to start with is the Buddha and the life of the Buddha. And I try to make that class like a recollection of the Buddha. Now, these would very soon within the Buddhist traditions themselves kind of get like formalized. And so, you might have heard like in Chinese Buddhism, you've got the names of the Buddha, right? Ingong, Rulai, Zampian, Zen, etc., etc. So you have like the 10 titles of the Blessed One. It's not, and the Blessed One itself is like the 11th. So you've got like these 11 common ones. So soon the basic sort of recollection of the Buddha would be like this reciting the different titles of the Buddha. I should say titles, epithets. I shouldn't say names because you don't say like Gautama, Siddhartha, Siddhartha. You're saying like, he is the Arahant, the awakened one, etc., teacher of gods and men, and so forth. And when you're thinking of each of these epithets, you're thinking of the good qualities of those. So it's keeping the Buddha in mind. And likewise for the Dhamma's got various good qualities. And then likewise for the Sangha too. The Sangha's got various qualities. There are the 4 pairs, right? Those on the path and those who have attained stream entry, those on the path and those who have attained once returner, never returner, and the Arahats. And for Mahayana traditions, you can add also the Bodhisattvas as members of the Sangha and so forth. So recollecting, being mindful of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha really foundational practice. You even see this, say, like in the Pure Land Sutras. It says, you know, the living beings in the Pure Land, they're just kind of this constant, like, recollection of the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So those are the three foundational ones, and sometimes you hear talk and text about the 3 recollections. Sometimes this gets then extended out to 6 of them, so they add on 3 more: morality, charity, and the divine. Now look here, morality and charity. The order's kind of switched, but these are our first 2 of the meritorious actions, right? So it's reflecting and recollecting charity and giving. It's going around with a mental state saying generosity is a good thing. And it's, you know, and it includes thinking about not just, you know, hey, I should try to be generous, but also reflecting about the good results of that generosity, and likewise for morality as well. The third one, here translated as the divine, because at least in the Chinese tradition, sometimes, so the term in the Chinese is tian, and it can be a little bit vague whether it's referring to the heavens or whether it's referring to heavenly beings. So I'm just putting the divine beings, divine places. And this also includes this idea, this kind of like ties many of them together. Recollection of the 3 jewels, the practice of morality and the practice of charity all lead to, on one side, good human rebirth and also divine rebirth. Very nice. And as I've stressed many times in the last few weeks, this is not something to be shunned in Buddhism. All right? Don't fall for those people like, oh, if that leads to the divine realm, well, that's like Christianity, therefore it can't be Buddhism. No, go study some Buddhism. This is quite a legitimate goal for Buddhist practitioners who feel that, you know, liberation is more of a long-term thing. You know, before you get there, being reborn in a good human state or in a divine state, no shame in that at all, and nothing to be afraid of or to look down on. And it can also mean not just this rebirth with the divine, but also through these practices, divine beings will support us and protect us. And most of those divine beings are there because they themselves have been generous and beautifully ethical. And this idea isn't just something in Buddhism. Like, look at, say, many of the Christian traditions. You know, how do saints become saints? I mean, a saint is someone who's in heaven, let's say, in a Catholic sense. How do they get there? Well, most of them are like, one, they not attached to the world. They're not materialistic, greedy people. They often do very beautiful acts of compassion and kindness, perform miracles, because, you know, when one has that purity of ethics and virtue, these things can happen. And so they themselves have become heavenly beings, divine beings, through these good actions, and they in turn look down at beings in the world and protect the good people who are also on the same path. So, you know, these 6 recollections then, like, you feel like you've got a lot of support. Here's a couple of things we can do. Be generous. Be a good person. Be a good and virtuous person as much as you can. And you're going to have the support of the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, and also the divine beings. Just as entering into bright radiance, the darkness of fear will immediately vanish. The divine is radiant. Even this word divine itself comes from terms meaning like radiant ones. Now, there's another term in Sanskrit, the Suras, and the Devas. They are radiant. That's what it means. That's what the divine beings or godly beings or deities are. They are radiant beings. That radiance comes from that relative purity. Again, I'm not saying the purity in the sense of a Buddha or a liberated Arahant or Bodhisattva, but compared to us, yeah, they're much further on the path. Okay, do we have time for one more verse? I think we do. Let's give it a try. Okay, so then we go into the 6 recollections, and there's a little bit of it going through the 6 in turn. And then it ends up, but it doesn't like actually have a verse for it, it just covers it in the commentary. But I've just covered it now, so we don't need to do that. And then we've got right collection of Maitreya Buddha. Now this is really interesting to me. This is again a bit of another sign of where this particular book comes from. So Master Taishu, who was big influence on Master In Shun, was a Maitreya devotee. A bit of a, Chinese Buddhism is pretty old school. There's different times in like Chinese Buddhist history where different like figures become more important. Now, I think a lot of people nowadays that don't maybe have that sense of history practicing modern Buddhism, it's all Shakyamuni Buddha, it's all Gautama Siddhartha. He's the figure, he's the historical Buddha, that's the main focus. But if you actually look at particularly like Mahayana Buddhism, and not always, sometimes the cult of Amitabha is far stronger. And I use cult here just not in the bad cult, like the weird, crazy cult type sense, but cult in the sense of like our worship of a particular religious figure, which is what cult originally comes from the Latin cultus. Often figures like Maitreya or Amitabha were far more powerful. Now, Amitabha, so the Pure Land ones, that's kind of like just been ongoing through so much of Chinese history. The cult of Maitreya is even earlier because that's something that we find even in early scriptures. And then the cult of Maitreya in Chinese Buddhism kind of comes and goes. And it came up in this like humanistic Buddhism movement. So Maitreya, and there's a whole background to that as well, and it came even a bit earlier than Master Taishu. There was a lot more interest in some of the Yogacara teachings. Many of these people felt that Yogacara teachings could be like an Asian Buddhist psychology in a time when like Freudian psychology was sweeping the world, shall we say. And I actually very much agree with this. With Buddhist psychology or most forms of yoga psychology over Freudian psychology any day. So they were kind of, and also suggesting, Taishu was saying, well, Buddhist psychology, Yogacara, and maybe a bit of Abhidharma can be quite scientific. Okay, maybe for another time. And we know sort of the patron Bodhisattva, the patron Buddha of Yogacara is Maitreya. That's one of the reasons why there was a cult of that. And so apparently Master Taishu, and they had a daily Maitreya practice. Cool stuff, huh? So we see that influence here in our text, the way to Buddhahood. So let's just go through this here. 正念弥勒尊，求生彼净土，法门虽细有，尽亦普及故。见佛时闻法，何忧于推堕？ Right recollection of Lord Maitreya, seeking rebirth in his Pure Land. This Dharma method is most precious and rare due to its accessibility, ease, and universality. When seeing the Buddha and hearing the Dharma, what worry is there of regression? So I think it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't need much of an explanation. So it's sort of saying that, like, like many of these practices for other Buddhas, there's this kind of sense of, like, these are troubled times. And we think to a mid-20th century Buddhism, yeah. In China, yeah, really troubled times. And so we're worried that, like, we're going to lose the Dharma and we'll also lose our opportunities to practice. Well, right now in the Tushita heaven, he's not a Buddha yet, he's a future Buddha, but he's one step away from becoming a Buddha, is none other than the Bhagavan Maitreya. And so recollection of Lord Maitreya, so this would be, just really in a general sense, forms of recollection of Maitreya Buddha. You can chant his name, you can reflect on his qualities, you can reflect on images, a statue, a painting. You can seek rebirth in his Pure Land, which is what's called in Chinese, it's like Nei Yuan, it's the inner compound of Tushita heaven. So Tushita heaven is like this whole heavenly world, pretty big. And then within that, there's like a little space, which is kind of like Lord Maitreya's space. There's another figure worth mentioning too about the worship of Lord Maitreya in the 20th century is the great master Xu Yun, the great Chan master. When he was very old, like literally in 115, 117, like so old, he, long story short, was beaten by some very nasty people. I think they were in probably the Red Guard or something, and kind of threw him into a coma. Like, happened twice. Each time he came out, he he described that during that state he had actually gone to the inner court of Maitreya and received teachings there. And there's been other practitioners that have had such sort of visions. Anyway, so you can make vows to be reborn there, just as you can make vows to be reborn in, say, Amitabha's Pure Land. And you can make vows to be reborn there now, and you can make vows so that in the future, when Maitreya is in this world and attains awakening, we can also be reborn there too, or you can do both. I mean, to me, go find him now, stick with him, and when he's reborn as Bodhisattva into this world in his last lifetime to become a Buddha, yeah, come on down and meet him. That would be absolutely amazing. So this Dharma method is most precious and rare, and for 3 reasons. It's accessible. Accessible is kind of like close in the sense of Maitreya is going to be Maitreya in this world. It's not some other world. It's fairly easy, that's a bit debatable. And universality, in other words, it's open to anyone. There's no restrictions. Some Buddha lands or Buddha fields, they sort of have like, you have to meet various like levels of practice or whatever to be reborn there. But Maitreya's is pretty open. And last of all, when seeing the Buddha and hearing the Dharma, what are you worrying about, like falling back? If you are in the presence of a Buddha and you are seeing that Buddha and you are hearing the Dharma from that Buddha, you're not awakened, but man, you're on the fast track. You are in such a strong position. It's a bit like the idea of, forfar none win, Jini win. It's difficult to hear the Dharma, but now I have this opportunity. Make the most of our human life if we've contacted the Dharma. Do our best to make the most of it, because we can unfortunately lose it all too easily. Okay, that's a good note to end today's class. We're a minute or 2 over, but I think that's not too bad for a class on the road. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you've had a good one, and hope to see you again next week. Take care.